Welcome to the September 19th service event of the North Texas Church of Freethought. We're on Zoom this morning, and we're going to post the recording of this presentation later. I would like to incorporate any comments, as I said, that you would like in the recorded part of the presentation near the end. So be ready for that, and then as usual, we'll have off-the-record discussion, ranting and shouting, or whatever you want to do after that. Hopefully not, mean-spirited stuff, but if you're not participating live, consider making an effort to do so in the future so you can share in that. And you have to go to our website to sign up for our e-newsletter. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and comment and subscribe and push those other buttons that will help us and help the cause. Tell others about us. Check out our other videos on YouTube. Many are from our in-person services over the years that we used to hold before the pandemic. We hope to eventually resume that. And check out our quite extensive website. At the bottom of every page on our website, there's a place to sign up to get our weekly notices. And we have, in fact, resumed some in-person get-togethers and for those who have been immunized. So that would be weekly game nights on Friday at a restaurant in Dallas. And also the first Sunday of the month, we have discussions over brunch, if you care to get brunch, at a hotel in Grapevine. And so if you sign up on the e-newsletter, you'll get the information on that. So, yes, we are atheists, but this is only because we generally find supernaturalism generally to be silly and implausible. We're not open to, and we have no interest in accepting claims about the objective world, quote unquote, on faith. We put a lot more stock in doubt, and in fact, we try not to believe too many things. We really kind of decry, lament the emphasis on faith and its combination with freedom, faith and freedom. Well, it's my freedom to have faith. Well, faith is just nothing but believing stuff because you want to and not because it's true. And there's all kinds of reasons why that's damaging to ourselves and our society. For us, religion has to do with the puzzle of meaning, what the point and purpose of our lives are. And I'm not talking about the purpose of humanity generally, but of our personal existence, and not to some supernatural overlord, but to ourselves, as to what our lives mean, and the question of how to carve out something positive and satisfying during whatever brief existence we may have. A world without our individual consciousness is not something that bothers us. It's often been said that religion is a way to allay the fear of death. I would say that most of us, most people in general, I don't think have a fear of death. They have a fear of dying. They don't want it to be painful. They don't want it to come too quickly or before they get certain things done. I think death bothers us mainly to the degree that we know we're going to miss out on whatever happens. But that's rather like all the beautiful experiences that we can never experience that have already happened over the billions of years that came before we were born. Just think about all the cute things the little dinosaur babies did when they hatched out of their eggs and were playing. But this is nothing to be terrified about, that we are never going to have those experiences unless we learn how to time travel. These things, missing out, is just the result of our severe limitations. Right now, we're missing out on all kinds of things happening all over the world, and we don't cry and have despair over it. As every American knows or should know, there's a race problem in the United States, and it is a serious problem. But it's also a misunderstood problem. Most people do not know, for example, that, as we have discussed previously, the World Values Survey has shown that racism is not worse in the USA than in other nations. In fact, the USA rates with the lowest of all countries when it comes to racism, along with Canada, the UK, Iceland, Norway, France, Germany, Scandinavian nations, even Brazil, Argentina, and of course, Australia. And this comes with the caveat that racism may mean, or the question that they use to detect so-called racism, cultures differ around the world as to what things mean. By contrast, the USA does not rank with the very lowest ranked nations when it comes to murder rates. And even if it did, murder would remain a serious problem as long as it was anything more than zero. And what the heck is going on here with Greenland anyway? Now, there are some unique challenges with the race problem, quote unquote. Perhaps the most troubling is the lack of understanding, let alone agreement, about what the problem actually is, where it came from, how it grew, and what has maintained and sustains it even now. Most Americans know it's connected somehow, historically anyway, with the institution of slavery in the South. In the 1860s, a bloody civil war was fought to end slavery, but the defeated Confederate states, as soon as they were able, went back to mistreating the former slaves and their descendants. In some ways, the mistreatment that followed the Civil War was worse than slavery had been. It took a century more for these abuses to be finally ended, and more accurately, it took a century before the force of laws and government in support of such abuses began to be dismantled. Meanwhile, through it all, and right through to the present, next slide there, most Americans believe that race is a real thing, that it has a biological basis. That's a scientific fact. They believe that there really are races or subspecies of humanity. They believe that everyone is born into some race, and that this is an important and permanent, as well as a fundamental element, if not the fundamental element of their identity. Oh, sure, there are mixed race people, but such people, they're a mixture of two or more basic elements that remain distinguishable even in their combination. There is still whiteness, blackness, and Asianness, even if one straddles the categories. Americans, by and large, Americans of all races, quote unquote, and even most of the academics and intellectuals who study these things, write about them, are paid to lecture and present workshops on them, and whose views are blasted out every day on TV and radio, even they do not seem to appreciate the radical incompatibility of racism and the belief in so-called race. They do not see the connection between the horrific facts of history, of slavery and the abuses connected with it, and what they mistakenly take to be an incontestable fact of reality. Now, why is this? Well, as there is when it comes to belief in religious supernaturalism, there seems to be a lot of inertia when it comes to people's ideas generally. Although people do recognize and often are willing to give up an idea for a better one, very often they cannot set aside the assumptions that they take to be just the way it's always been. If I were to make this cartoon, I would think I would put one or two people up to the unpleasant truth, but have them be looking over longingly, wistfully at the comforting lies. So an example of what I'm talking about is that, for example, many of us know sensible Christians, so-called liberal Christians, who manage to suppose that the worst absurdities in their holy book, the parts they don't like, are symbolic or allegorical, while insisting that the parts they like carry divine authority as God's word. I mean, isn't it weird that there are Christian churches that cater to homosexuals, considering what's in the Bible about homosexuality? But people just can't let go of the feeling that there must be something to what they have long accepted without question. It has been said that not remembering the past condemns us to repeat it. Well, we could riff on that idea all day, I think, including whether everything about the past is a bad thing that we should not want to go back to. More on that later. As you saw to begin with, we have a little bit of a time travel element of today's presentation. But for now, it's well to realize that it's hard to remember things that happened before we existed. Even historians are plagued with the fragmentary and often confusing evidence that are all we can rely on when it comes to remembering the past and, more importantly, trying to understand it. Even in the present, what happens is understood differently by different people. We see that every day. So let me begin with Jamestown. You see it's down there on the lower portion of the pink area at the mouth of Chesapeake Bay. This was the first permanent English settlement in North America. It was founded in 1607. The famous Mayflower landing in Plymouth, Massachusetts, that wasn't until 1620. By then, there were already almost 1,000 people living in and around Jamestown. The colony had been originally set up by the Virginia Company for the purposes of establishing England's claim to North America. That was important. Also to find gold and silver and other natural resources, and to find a passage to the Pacific Ocean, because no one then knew what rivers lay to the west. Maybe there was a way to navigate up this river, build a canal here, go up another river. And finally, they wanted to trade with the Native Americans because already a lot of money had been made to the north, trading furs and so forth. But within a few years, the colonists at Jamestown were at odds with the natives, and that conflict only ended, rather inconclusively, really, in 1614 when Pocahontas, the daughter of Chief Powhatan, married the English planter John Rolfe. Here we see them marrying. There's a whole backstory with that, too. It turns out Pocahontas was married before. She was not some Disney character. Rolfe's experimentation with growing tobacco seeds brought from the West Indies, apparently there was a cultivar in the West Indies that tasted better to people who were into smoking, that ultimately led to the colony becoming profitable. But the cultivation and export of tobacco required labor, and a lot of it. Forcing the natives to work was not a good solution, since they could just run off into the woods and rejoin their tribes. Indentured servitude worked better, and for many years this Headright system worked pretty well. Under this scheme, anyone who came or paid the way for others to come to the colony in exchange for a period of servitude, they got 50 acres of land per person. So if you were wealthy, you could become a planter who could pay the way for 10 people to come over from England or Ireland, and often such people didn't have much choice in the matter. Kind of like today, a lot of times you make choices, but you make them out of necessity and duress. But you could get 500 acres for 10 people to grow more tobacco. It was a win-win for all but the imported servants, who were often treated badly or died of disease before they could earn their freedom, as usual when they were sold how wonderful this is to come to America. They were kind of oversold. Then in 1619, that year will stick in your mind, it is estimated that at that time Jamestown was home to about 700 people, and this English ship, the White Lion, famously brought to Jamestown 20-some Africans that were sold for provisions. And this was the beginning of slavery in North America. Well, not really, though. The White Lion was not a slave ship. It was not a part of the Atlantic slave trade, which at the time was shipping African slaves not to North America, but to South America and the Caribbean. The Africans brought to Jamestown in 1619, in fact, had been stolen by the White Lion from a Portuguese slave ship. For the White Lion was a privateer, a ship operating under government authorization. It was basically a pirate ship, but kind of authorized piracy, the government in this case being the Dutch Prince of Orange, who was then at war with the Portuguese. Also, although there is some disagreement about this, when the White Lion sold its captives, they became indentured servants under the Headright systems, not perpetual slaves. So they would have signed on for a period of servitude, like being a slave, for anywhere from 4 to 7 years is what's usually quoted, and then after then to go free and even be given land and tools and weapons to be able to function on their own. In fact, it was another African brought to Jamestown only 2 years later in 1621, one Anthony Johnson. He managed to fulfill his indentured contract, got his own land, and then his own servants, and he became prosperous. But by the time he died in 1670, things had changed. His children did not inherit his lands because he was, quote, not a citizen of the colony because of his ancestry. This is a fascinating story, by turns surprising, inspiring, and very disheartening. Look it up if you're so inclined. The guy's name was Anthony Johnson. In the years after the White Lion weighed anchor and sailed away, there were not many African ancestry people in Jamestown, but their numbers gradually increased. In 1625, only 23 were recorded. 23 years later, in 1648, there were 300. But 23 years after that, in 1671, there were 2,000. What is fascinating is that through all these years, there did not seem to be any sort of race problem there in Jamestown. People then did not have the modern concept of race and racism that we have today. They did not identify as, quote unquote, being of some particular skin color or ancestry as people do, or as people are expected to do today. My gosh, if you don't identify as something, why, there's something wrong with you. Such beliefs that are so widespread and taken for granted today just did not exist. Rather, as the late professor of anthropology, Audrey Smedley, as you can see, herself of African ancestry, as she put it, people of the same station in life, regardless of anything else, socialized together. They worked together, they played together, they drank together, they slept together, they lived together. The first mulatto child was born in 1620. That's the year after the White Lion sold its human cargo, remember? When you read descriptions of the period, you get the picture that color doesn't make much difference. Physical features don't make much difference to these people because they were all in the same boat. They saw themselves as having in common how they were related to the planters, the big owners. Servants were subjected to all sorts of cruel forms of punishment, so they ran away together when they were unhappy about their situation. Indeed, in 1640, 3 of them did run away together, attempting to escape their contractual servitude by fleeing to Maryland. All 3 were caught, and one of them, a guy named John Punch, was sentenced to perpetual servitude, while his accomplices only had their indentures extended by 4 years. The court took notice of Punch's, quote, being a Negro, unquote. The others, you see, were of European ancestry. It's impossible to know the thinking of the judges then, but under the English common law, a Christian could not enslave a Christian, so this may have had something to do with it. At any rate, John Punch is generally regarded, justifiably, as their first official slave in the English colonies. So maybe we should have a 1640 project. And I guess this goes, it's a little bit of a reference to the 1619 project, and I think it's an interesting question, and we'll have to discuss that again sometime. We have discussed it in the past. What should we be celebrating when we celebrate our nation and think of the United States of America, which we would like to think highly of, but we seem to like to also think that we're a terrible nation with awful defects and faults that are never going to get any better. And I wonder how much of this grows out of the Christianity. We're better than everybody else because we're Christians. At the very same time, they have this schizophrenic, we're all sinners, and if we do wrong, that's because of Satan, and we're fallen, blah, blah, blah. There's a real kind of disconnect between whether we should admire or condemn our nation. And yet, even though that first perpetual slave in 1640 was adjudicated, slavery did not legally exist in Virginia until 1661. That was the same year Barbados enacted a slave code. Curiously, Massachusetts seemed to have recognized slavery 20 years earlier, sort of, in 1641. But back to Virginia, in that colony in 1662, the next year after basically was recognized, a law established that the status of children born to African ancestry women was that they were, quote, to serve according to the condition of the mother, unquote. Now that was even if the father was not African ancestry, and that was definitely a break from the English common law, and really that's the beginning of chattel slavery. But picture the situation. As the population of Virginia increased, so did the numbers of African ancestry individuals, especially after the legal establishment of slavery. Imported more, but of course they were breeding more, so I guess, an African ancestry person of either sex could have children with others, and then suddenly you've increased the number of African ancestry, because if you have any African ancestry, you're African ancestry, and we'll talk more about that in a second. Meanwhile, the indentured servants were surviving longer. Many were able to complete their contracts, like Anthony Johnson, and claim their freedom and lands, even as the available lands were shrinking. And the Native American tribes were being encroached upon more and more. Understandably, the attractions of slavery for the wealthy planters grew, but so also did the revolts and rebellions of the underclasses become more frequent and severe. And the most important of these came in 1676 in the form of Bacon's Rebellion. Here's the picture that was on the e-newsletter that you received 2 weeks in a row now. On the 19th of September, 1676, yes, exactly 100 years before the celebrated year of 1776, an organized force of hundreds, some accounts say about 1,000 armed men, under the command of one Nathaniel Bacon, attacked and burned Jamestown to the ground. This is the picture, as I said, that was featured in the e-newsletter, famous picture. Bacon's rebellion has been characterized by some historians as a personal power struggle between planter Nathaniel Bacon and Governor William Berkeley. Both were members of the English upper class. In fact, they were related by marriage, and the older Berkeley, the governor, had even appointed Bacon to the governor's council. But they differed over relations with the Native American tribes, with Berkeley wishing to keep the peace. That was part of his responsibility, in fact, as governor, and Bacon wanting harsher measures against the constant attacks on the outlying regions by the native tribes. Bacon drew most of his support from the discontent of the lowest-ranking laborers, as well as those recently released from their indentures who were given lands, and of course, as said, the lands they were given were of increasingly poorer quality. Most alarming to the authorities was that these malcontents, including people of both European and African ancestry. But soon after Jamestown was burned, Bacon died of dysentery, which deprived the rebellion of its leadership. A number of others were apprehended and executed for their part in the disturbances. I think it was like 23 people altogether that were executed. But it was realized now that something had to change, and change it did. As Audrey Smedley noted, it was quite clear that this kind of unity and solidarity among the poor was dangerous. After that, the authorities began to pass laws. Very gradually, they passed laws that gave Europeans privileges, while they increasingly enslaved Africans. They passed a number of laws that prevented blacks, Indians, and mulattoes from owning firearms, for example. Then there was another change. There was a decline in the number of European servants coming to the New World. At the same time, there was an increase in the ships bringing Africans to the New World. By the 1690s or so, the English themselves had outfitted their ships to bring Africans back from the continent, and that is the first time that they had had direct connections. By the turn of the century, about 1700 in other words, England had become the largest trafficker in slaves in the Western world. And you see how they made good use of their ships. Their ships were never empty. They were always moving something. And as the 18th century wore on, a steady series of additional laws were enacted prohibiting intermarriage of what we now call blacks and whites, prohibiting the education of slaves, calling for the lashing and even killing of troublesome slaves. Of course, they're all quote-unquote Negroes by now, and requiring slaves traveling outside of the lands of their masters to have certificates of permission and so on. Where are your papers? Like the Nazis did in the old movies. Even free people of African ancestry were not allowed to vote or enjoy other freedoms that everyone else was taking for granted. Every effort was made to separate, stigmatize, and intimidate quote-unquote Negroes who were considered fit only to be slaves. In practical terms, Negro became synonymous with slaves. By the time of the Civil War, this had hardened to the point where we've talked before about the cornerstone speech that was given by the Confederate Vice President Stevens, I believe is his name, where they just talk about their racism and enslavement of people of African ancestry like it was a badge of honor. But with this absurd project and the notion that people of African ancestry are a separate and distinct race came the even more absurd problem: how to determine what race someone is. And eventually the one-drop rule was laid down that any African ancestry made one a Negro. And with this came the idea of passing as something that you're not. But think about it. Is a person who is 1/32 part black and 31/32 parts white, are they passing? And if they are passing passing as white or are they passing as black? What if they identify as black? Maybe they're only passing as black. And this is the modern day equivalent of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. And it's a good analogy in as much as both angels and race are fictional constructs. It's not hard to see the motivations at work. 17th century Virginia planters wanted cheap and abundant labor. But they and their descendants also did not want to feel as if they were abusing and brutalizing other human beings. And we've seen this constantly in the case of wars where the enemy is dehumanized and turned into animals and just disgusting things that everybody had to fight against. But that's usually just for the duration of the war and maybe for some time after. Think about doing this on an ongoing, systematic basis for generations to realize that the people you're brutalizing, or believe that the people you're brutalizing are being different in a fundamental sense. And then think of what happens when some people are made to feel that they are fundamentally inferior or superior. What sort of effect would you expect that to have on people over generations? What kind of effect would you expect that to have on society as a whole? This is like a civil war from before the USA was founded, and that continues today. That we've never been over the Civil War, we've just been over the hostilities, the actual shedding of blood, although not always, because blood is still shed here and there, as we know. It's almost inconceivable to think of the damage that these practices and policies did over generations and is really still taking place today. Much of the damage is not even recognized as such. Some of it is even celebrated. For when people are physically and socially divided, whether naturally in some way Some people go and form a colony somewhere, or go to another continent. Or as in the case of blacks and whites, where they're forcibly segregated with laws against intermarriage and so forth. Well, what happens is, obviously, the different groups go on to develop different cultural norms, different attitudes, and even different dialects. Now, few of these differences are really intrinsically superior or inferior, and so people come to feel comfortable with, and they even treasure those differences. Well, we don't talk like them. We don't make salsa like they do in New York City. We have to eat our Texas salsa. But people come to feel that those differences are essential elements of their being. And that's even though the ancestors that they all both came from knew nothing of those differences and were no part of their existence. We often feel that now in the 21st century, we have better ways to live than our ancestors knew. And certainly this is the case with many things. Think about 500 years ago, for example, and before, people with mental illness were treated terribly. Similarly, the conditions of indentured servitudes in 17th century Jamestown that we were just talking about, by today's standards, those are simply unacceptable. It's dizzying to think of all the examples we might point to, but in some instances, there are ways of thinking and behaving that our ancestors did better than we do. I invite you to consider that going forward to the past, the opposite of back to the future, may be a good idea when we think about the race problem. For back in 1619, as Professor Smedley observed, people of all colors and ancestries socialized together, worked together, played together, drank together. Because for them, color doesn't make much difference. Physical features don't make much difference because they were all in the same boat. And now think of the obstacles that have been set up against people doing these things today because of what started out back in the 17th century. Well, obviously, thank goodness, and there we are all in the same boat. We don't live in 17th century Jamestown, and even today it would not be a good idea for people of all colors and ancestries to get together and socialize and find common cause and then take up arms and burn stuff down. But wouldn't it be something if these general attitudes of social cohesion and solidarity could be rekindled in our present day when there are so many better ways to find common cause with others, in our work, in our interests, in our efforts to improve ourselves and the world around us, to learn, to grow, and to leave something important behind. And I think there are signs of this happening. It's certainly that we're not back in the 19th century anymore, because we are all in the same boat. Or if we're not, and if you look up the meme of being all in the same boat, you'll find a lot of people saying, no, we're not all in the same boat. But if we're not all in the same boat, at least we're all in the same storm. We all, for the most part, have the same problems and the same worries. Yet we must share a world, and that world needs to be and can be improved in so many ways. And I like to think that this church is a small effort, one of those attempts, one of those ways. But it is a problem that people just aren't used to seeing themselves as having essentially common interests. Everywhere there are calls to differentiate and distinguish and separate ourselves from others, to see what divides us as important, and to lose sight of our common humanity. And who benefits from that? Who is better off when people are at odds with one another, when people feel separate and suspicious of each other? Well, it's the same sort of people who began passing all those slave codes in the 17th and 18th centuries. The same people that were the race theorists back in those days, who gave lectures, wrote books, and taught at universities in order to justify slavery and segregation. Now that is something to think about. As I said earlier, that we're still in a civil war. It's just different. But it started a long time before the actual Civil War. I want to close with an excerpt from a statement by the American Anthropological Association. Reads, in the United States, both scholars and the general public have been conditioned to viewing human races as natural and separate divisions within the human species based on visible physical differences. Think about that word, conditioned. Not persuaded, not shown by the strength of evidence, just conditioned. With the vast expansion of scientific knowledge in this century, however, it has become clear that human populations are not unambiguous, clearly demarcated, biologically distinct groups. Evidence from the analysis of genetics, that is DNA, and we only knew about the structure of DNA now since 1953, indicates that most physical variation, about 94%, lies within so-called racial groups. Conventional geographic racial groupings differ from one another only in about 6% of their genes. This means that there is greater variation within racial groups than between them. So two people of the same quote-unquote race are more different than each other than people generally between racial groups. In neighboring populations, there is much overlapping of genes, and their phenotypic, that's the physical appearance, expressions. Throughout history, whenever different groups have come into contact, they have interbred. The continued sharing of genetic materials has maintained all of humankind as a single species. That's up on their website, www.americananthro.org. And with that, let's have some comments and questions. If there's anything I was unclear about, or if there's anything I said that was just absolutely wrong or repugnant to you, now's the time to speak up, and we'll include this in the posted YouTube video.
I
hope. Go ahead.
I just had a comment regarding the 6% of genes. What is the difference in terms of? My understanding is a difference in genetic code between humans and frogs, for example, are really not that great. There's not the amount of differentiation is not a very big percentage of chromosomes. Am I misunderstanding that?
Yes, I think so, because as we've all heard, I think that we differ from chimpanzees in only about 2% of our DNA, but that's a difference in the DNA as a whole, not in individual genes. So the interesting thing here, of course, is that these different racial groupings, there's only about a 6% difference. I mean, there has to be some genetic difference because how much melanin you produce in your skin and some of these other traits, the hair form and so forth, those are genetically determined traits, there's no doubt about it. But think about all the traits that are not so obvious. This happens all the time in my practice. I come across people who are not in my quote-unquote race, but they've got the same blood type as I have. You know, if your blood type just determined your skin color, we look the same. So, you know, as the statement said, the interbreeding of different populations has kept there from being any kind of speciation or subspeciation in humans.
Thank you.
Can you stop sharing your screen so we can see each other, and anybody who doesn't want to be recorded can stop video.
This is only for people who want to be recorded for the YouTube video, and I'll stop sharing after I make some additional comments. If anybody else has questions or comments, I think Don's comment was very important, because for him to have it means that other people who will see this later on YouTube may have that too, and I do want to clarify anything. So if we're ready to move on, then we'll do that. I should say that the most important sort of diversity is not the color of our skin or our gender preference, size, weight, taste in music, or other things that we have little or no control over. The most important sort of diversity is the diversity of ideas, and that is shaped by diversity of backgrounds and experiences, and those things are very different. When we interact with others, let us not be like the supernaturalist religious zealots who are only happy if they can get others to agree with them. And if they can't get you to agree, then they're going to pray for you. They're going to try to get supernatural powers to force you to agree with them. But let us instead strive for and be satisfied with understanding and being understood. And I thank Don for asking that question, because that, I think, help us understand. There's a big difference between persuading others and just understanding and being understood. If we keep this in mind, we can discover that there are lots of ways to interact with civility, and we can do better if we determine to do so. We can consider ideas without accepting them. Indeed, we benefit when we consider wrong ideas and figure out why and in what ways they're wrong. Sometimes it's not so obvious when you're talking with somebody. You don't need to come back at them, well, you're wrong. Give it some thought. There's probably a lot of ways that you haven't thought about it, given some time and ability to reflect. Also, there are kernels of truth in things that are wrong. Think about what kernels of truth those things contain and what it is about them that may appeal to otherwise well-intended people. Always, always let us not believe too much or too strongly. It's enough to know of many things without becoming very attached to any of them. And this is the only way, after all, that we learn. Remember that we are minds and bodies, and that means we should pay attention to our physical state, our tone of voice, any rising feelings of anxiety or being threatened. You know, we often just kind of own our emotions, and we should realize that those can interfere with what we really want to be. And if we really prize reason so much, we should realize that emotions often get in the way of that. We often don't react in the moment the way that we later, when we have the time and opportunity to think about these things, would have liked. So sometimes it's best to just take a deep breath and let things go. This is the way of free thinkers. I will just remind us of our principles of reason, how we make sense of things. We don't make sense of things by our feelings and, oh, something happened to me, and so I have to believe in God because a traffic light turned at the time that I wished God would change it for me. Enjoyment, that we should definitely pursue happiness, the positive emotions, and trying to make sense of those, and even the negative emotions, trying to put those in perspective. Appreciation, that we discover the good and what's valuable to us, and that can change over time. What's important to you at one time may not be so important at another, and this is all part of learning and growth. And finally, love, which has to do with exploring the meaning and purpose, what we take to be the real point and purpose of religion. We ask not just for your moral support and participation in the discussion of the ideas that are important to us, but also for your financial support. Let us know what else you would like to see us do, and be prepared to help us accomplish it. Our Church of Freethought is a tool, a vehicle for doing things, not just, and that includes socialization, but it can include other things as well. Please visit us on Facebook and Twitter. There have been some new posts up there recently. We're not very active there, but they're outposts of our way of thinking, and they are important ways for us to increase and improve the impact of free thought. Your values are at stake, after all. If you're truly committed to those values, if you believe they are important, remember that belief is, as Charles Sanders Peirce pointed out, a disposition to act. If you believe something, but it doesn't really cause you to act in one way or another, then how much of a belief is that? We find fault with others who do not act in support of the values they say they hold, so let us act in support of our values. Together, we can do so much more. We are lucky to have each other in this church. Let us make the most of us and the most of what we can do together. As Gandhi put it, be the future you wish to see. So, thank you and good morning. And with that, for those of us in today's video conference, we'll go to discussion, but I'll just kind of drone on here for a moment so it's not cut off. Again, thank you.